sounds like a story to me, some crazy fable that you would not believe. Oh, but ain't she...
Welcome to the Avram Davidson universe, where we listen to some of the greatest stories ever written, adored by Ursula Le Guin, Neil Gaiman, Leonard Nimoy, Ray Bradbury, and Stephen King. Enjoy classic tales such as Are All the Seas with Oysters, The Golem, Sources of the Nile, and many others.
Today we have a very special episode of the Avram Davidson podcast, the Avram Davidson universe. We have joining us today Genre Podcast, which features Zac, Jon, and Bob. Today we're reading a story called Dagon, which was published originally in 1959, an Avram Davidson story that is very realistic. There is not science fiction elements. There are no fantasy elements in it. It's all realism. But we're going to talk about it today a little bit in the style of Genre Podcast. So I want to invite Zac and Jon onto the Avram Davidson universe. And you guys tell us a little bit about how Genre Podcast works. What is Genre Podcast?
Sure. So I think the starting seed of the idea was that we want to read books that otherwise, maybe we wouldn't make the time to read in the first place, right? Mm-hmm. Like there's all those like bucket list books that you can think about, like, oh, I always wish I read Crime and Punishment, but you never sit around and say, I wish I read that old cowboy Western novel paperback that you see on your uncle's bookshelf. You know what I mean? Oh, yeah. So Genre Podcast kind of started with the idea of like, how can we create a system for ourselves to like hit these books to make it happen? And the way we do that is basically we start with a theme or a sequence of books centered around a different genre. So like maybe we'll do 4 mystery novels, we'll do 5 Westerns. Sometimes we throw in like a classic film in there. And the idea is like, by doing these sequences, we can kind of see what the connections are between them. We can learn a little bit more about the genre, and we can check off some real interesting, entries in the history of books.
Oh yeah, it's interesting as well. Like in reading these books that I never would have ordinarily read, like first thing that comes to mind for me is like Westerns, like True Grit, and just find out that I actually love these books and think like Westerns is a great genre, and True Grit is now one of my favorite books. So I think there's that element of like discovery as well. Like when you force yourself to do something that you wouldn't maybe have done before, or you read things that you have just aren't naturally part of your sort of mental universe, then I think there's something really fun about that.
I think so too. I think it's been great.
There's also
you go ahead, Zac. You go ahead.
Oh, well, I was gonna say there's also books that like you kind of always want to read because you know a lot about them already. Like we'll say Sherlock Holmes or even James Bond. Like we all know Sherlock Holmes and James Bond. They are cultural touchstones. Yeah. But I think that actually sitting down and reading the texts in which those films are based off of really gives you new insight into the characters, and for me that's been a really fun discovery, like finding the original seed of these things that have taken on their own life in the culture.
Actually, like living with these characters, I think it's fun too. I was thinking about this today. My memory is awful, and if I just read these books on my own and then hope I'm going to remember them, it's gone. I can go back and listen to our podcast from like 3 years ago. I'm like, oh yes, these are our notes. This is what we discovered from these books.
Yeah. That is very handy. I'm like you, Bob. Forgetful. Mine like a sieve.
Yeah, it's a complete sieve. Well, I was looking at My Man in Havana. I forgot that we read that book, and then
great book, by the way. That was so fun.
It's a great book, so I'd recommend.
Our Man in Havana just being the sort of like most straight-laced, pathetic, weedy, administrative guy.
The most pathetic with the biggest impact, like a man who does not want to achieve anything and just causes so much
forced into an international criminal conspiracy.
Yeah, because he's making people up. So I love that. It's like we now have a great, like, exhaustive list of notes that we can go back to, and it's good for making this podcast too, because like what you're doing now, Zach, too, is kind of creating even better notes that are kind of organized to search things, to create that web between genres. We've been able to connect recently doing nautical lore, night stories like Arthurian night tales, because they're referenced here in a pirate story. And then we can, because we have this kind of bank of books that we've read and this record, we can make better comparisons. I feel like our, I don't know, it's just a great aid in reading, making a podcast like genre.
I probably also wouldn't have understood those Arthurian night references in that story. You know, I mean, let's be real. I don't always like if the pirate says by Lancelot's beard or something like that. I'm probably not going to open up Wikipedia to figure out what's going on with Lancelot or Percival. You know what I mean? But yeah. having like read some stories, it's like, oh yeah, okay, yeah, by their beard, sure.
By their beard, by the beard of Lancelot.
I always think of Lancelot as being clean shaven.
I needed a good pirate speak, so those were the first two words that came to my mind. Lancelot's beard.
One thing about Lancelot as well, as the great critic Philomena Kunk once said, he came a lot.
Damn.
Yes.
It was a wonderful time and came a lot. Oh my God. All right. Yes,
she says, there's another part of that Philomena Kunk bit. She says they had the Knights Round Table, which was kind of like a lazy Susan.
Yeah. You gotta watch this person. This is a comic?
Yeah, you gotta watch it, man. You gotta watch it. It's this I don't know how to describe a British like TV presenter.
Cool.
But it's like a skit. It's a comedy parody of a TV presenter of kind of an intellectual documentary about like the history of Britain or the history of like humankind or something.
Oh damn! Okay, that sounds great. Oh, we should start doing we'll do a news segment in genre someday, covering the news. Since we were just talking about like doing, I can't remember. But what are we doing now for? I know we're finishing up nautical lore, and we just have one left. I think, right? We're just doing Muppet Treasure Island.
Yeah,
I
so we just read Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island. Before that was a Robert E. Howard short story, and then we also did a Poe short story. But we thought the best way to follow up Treasure Island, the book, is of course to watch the most famous and best adaptation to film, which is Muppet Treasure Island, the classic.
And after we get done with these nautical lore, which has been a lot of fun, lots of pirates, lots of sea shanties, we are going next to Dune. What are our hopes for Dune, Zach? How many Dune books are we going to read?
I think we're going to read 6 Dune books.
Damn, okay. How many pages are we looking at there?
Oh, a lot of pages, a lot of big word count. My hopes is that you guys don't tap out before the end. That's I think this is my biggest fear.
I think they're all very readable. I mean, at least book one's very readable. Like once we get to, have you read Chapter House Dune? Is it as readable?
I've read them all. They're all readable, but they all just get weirder and more uncomfortable.
Good. Okay, that's great.
Yeah, as Frank Herbert gets older, he gets hornier for sure. I'll say that. Frank Herbert definitely gets hornier.
I did not expect that's where it was gonna go.
Yeah, it's I don't want to say it was a challenging listen, but like when I did the audiobooks, but it was definitely like there were some eyebrow moments where I was like, wait, what?
Cool. Okay. Well, I wanted to ask, since we're going into Dune, which is, a mix of fantasy and a mix of sci-fi, Dagon is definitely more realistic, but it has maybe some connections. So like we've read some travel stories a little bit. We've read some like lost world stories or travelers going into a place they've never been to before. So I was wondering if we were going to look at this Dagon story, which is about a man who goes to China and is living there for a very long time, it sounds like. Where would we fit this into genre? Can you think of a genre that Dagon would work for? Travel diary?
Maybe travel
Realistic.
diary.
For me, there were
Yeah.
two books that really jumped out in my mind.
Hmm.
And I think placing them in terms of a genre would be difficult, but certainly a perspective. The first one would be we read Graham Greene's The Quiet American,
Oh, yeah.
which is kind of like what's that about? So that's like about a love affair between
It's in Vietnam.
a man who's been working
Yeah.
in Vietnam, and then there's like the CIA agent hotshot who comes in and
Yeah.
takes his wife and messes up everything politically in Vietnam. That kind of like fish out of water, no pun intended, perspective of being in a foreign culture, feeling alienated, things not going right, negative perspective. To me, there were some real resonances. And then the other one, which we didn't read, but we could and possibly should, is Joseph Conrad. We've read Joseph Conrad for sure, but
Secret Agent,
we have not read.
Yes.
Oh
Heart
my
of
God, what's that book
Darkness.
called? Heart of Darkness. Yeah,
It definitely does have Heart of Darkness
strong-
vibes as well.
Yeah, strong Kurtz vibes.
Do you
But, yeah.
remember
Yes,
the Kurtz we saw in
definitely.
real life? You guys remember that?
Yeah, I remember that guy.
Yeah, for context,
Oh, yeah.
Zach, John, and I all lived in China.
His
like in
presence was
1970,
like
yeah.
touching like an electric wire or something. You immediately go, "Whoa!"
Yeah.
Yeah. I should have written down quotes from that guy at the moment, because all I remember is the feeling that guy left me with, not like
Yeah.
the actual like content of his perspective. But yeah.
I think
It
we're
had
in,
something to do, and I think it had something to do
Yeah.
with similar to what this story is about as well. It had something to do like decay, like things aren't the same anymore. Things are going, I don't know. He was talking about some kind of wider decay that he's perceiving.
Yeah.
I think.
I think he was trying to get out too. We met him in Xi'an,
Yeah.
and he's not from, but he lived in Shenzhen, and he was like, I can't take it anymore. I've been here for a year and a half. I can't do anymore.
Yeah.
If you've heard the rumors,
Yeah.
they all come
That
from
was
here.
it. That was it. Yeah, that was it.
Yeah. I hope that guy made it out before the lockdowns, because
I know.
I couldn't imagine being him in that.
He's probably still there in
Oh.
The
line. for the
lockdowns
same
are back
sandwich.
now as well. It's crazy. Lockdowns are back as of like right now.
Yeah.
Well,
Did they ever leave?
Yeah, they periodically leave and then re-arrive again.
Yeah.
Zero policy, zero COVID
Zero
policy,
case. Yeah, the zero case policy.
zero case policy.
It's intense.
So for me, I
Also
felt like
Bratstone, turns out.
I felt like the Avram Davidson podcast selected this story for us with that in mind. Maybe it was just a coincidence, but I felt a little targeted, a little typecast here.
Yeah, a little typecast. I thought it would be nice. We can. So Zach, John, and I all lived there, and I figured we have the experience. We could talk about it. We could talk about people like Kurtz, that Kurtz-like person. And I think we're gonna listen to it. I think we should listen to it first, and we'll talk about it. But I picked it because I feel like we've met lots of people like this main character in different ways, living in China. So I thought we would talk about that and like the foreigner living in China kind of experience. So anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, John.
No. I was agreeing with your statement.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Giddy up. That's
Giddy
all
up.
I gotta say. Giddy
All
up.
right. Now here's Dagon, published in 1959 by Avram Davidson.
Dagon. Then the lords of the Philistines gathered together to rejoice before Dagon their god. And behold, the image of Dagon was fallen upon its face to the ground, with both his face and his hands broken off, and only the fishy part of Dagon was left to him. The old Chinese, half-magician, half-beggar, who made the bowl of goldfish vanish and appear again, this old man made me think of the Aztecs and the wheel. Or gunpowder. Gunpowder appeared in Western Europe, and Western Europe conquered the world with it. Gunpowder had long ago been known in China, and the Chinese made firecrackers with it. They have since learned better. When I was free, I heard men say more than once that the American Indians did not know the use of the wheel until Europeans introduced it. But I have seen a toy, pre-conquest, fashioned from clay, which showed that the Aztecs knew the use of the wheel. They made toys of it. Firecrackers, vanishing goldfish, noise, light and darkness. The bright lotus blossoms in the dark mire. Lotus, plural, lotoi, loti. That is a coincidence. On October 12, 1900, Pierre Loti left at Taku, the French naval vessel which had brought him to China, and proceeded to Peking. Part of that city was still smoking. Boxers and their victims were still lying in the ruins. On October 12, 1945, I left the American naval vessel which had brought me and my fellow officers to China, and proceeded to Peking. Peiping, as they called it then. I was not alone. The whole regiment came. The people turned out and hailed and glorified us. China, our friend and partner in the late great struggle. The traffic in women, narcotics, stolen goods, female children. Merely the nation's peculiar institution. Great is China, for there I was made manifest. Old, 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 crumbling temples, closed-off palaces, abandoned yamens. Mud-colored walls with plaster crumbling off them reached a few feet over a man's head and lined the alleys so that if a gate was closed, all that could be seen was the rooftop of a one-story building or the upper lineage of a tree, and if a gate was open, a tall screen directly in front of it blocked the view, except for tiny glimpses of flagstone-paved courtyards and plants in huge glazed pots. Rich and poor, and in between, and shabby genteel lived side by side, and there was no way of knowing if the old man in dun-colored rags who squatted by a piece of matting spread with tiny paper squares, holding tinier heaps of tea, or groups of 4 peanuts, or 10 watermelon seeds, was as poor as he and his trade seemed, or had heaps of silver tails buried beneath the 4th tile from the corner near the stove. Things were seldom what they seemed. People feared to tempt powers, spiritual or temporal, or illegal, by displays of well-being. The brick screens blocked both the gaze of the curious and the path of demons. Demons can only travel in straight lines. It is the sons of men whose ways are devious. Through these backways and byways, I used to roam each day. I had certain hopes and expectations based on romantic tales read in adolescence, and was bound that the Cathayans should not disappoint. When these alleys led into commercial streets, as they did sooner or later, I sought what I sought there as well. It is not too difficult to gain a command of spoken Mandarin, which is the dialect of Peking, the throaty sound which distinguishes, for example, between li zat, peaches, and li jia, chestnuts, is soon mastered. The more southerly dialects have 11 or 19 or some such fantastic number of inflections, but Pekingese has only 4. Moreover, in the south, it is hot and steamy, and the women have flat noses. In one of my wanderings, I came to the ponds where the carp had been raised for the imperial table in days gone by. Strange it was to realize that some of the great fish slowly passing up and down among the lily paths must have been fed from the bejeweled hands of old Buddha herself, and that others, in all likelihood, huge they were and vast, not only outdated the dowager, but may well have seen, like some strange billowing shadow above the water sky, Chien Lung the Great, he who deigned to accept tribute from Catherine of Russia, scattering rice cake like manna. I mused upon the mystery of fish, their strange and mindless beauty, how, innocently evil, they prey upon each other, devouring the weaker and smaller without rage or shout or change of countenance. There, in the realm of water, which is also earth and air to them, the great fish passed up and down, growing old without aging, and enjoying eternal growth without the softness of obesity. It was a world without morality, a world without choices, a world of eating and spawning and growing great. I envied the great fish, and in other smaller ponds, the lesser fish, darting and flashing and sparkling gold. They speak of the beast in man and of the law of the jungle. Might they not, so I reflected, strolling underneath a sky of clouds as blue and as white as the tiles and marble of the altar of heaven, might they not better speak of the fish in man, and of the law of the sea from which they say we came? Sometimes, but only out of sociability, I accompanied the other officers to the sing-song houses. A man is a fool who cannot accommodate himself to his fellows enough to avoid discomfort. But my own tastes did not run to spilled beer and puddles of inferior tea and drink-thickened voices telling tales of prowess, nor to grinning lackeys in dirty robes, or short sessions in rabbit-warren rooms with bodies which moved and made sounds and asked for money, but showed no other signs of sentient life. Once, but only once, we visited the last of the imperial barber eunuchs who had attended to the toilet of the dowager's unfortunate nephew. A tall old man, this castrate, living alone with his poverty. He did for us what he would for any others who came with a few coins and a monstrous curiosity. I mingled also, officially and otherwise, with the European colony, none of whom had seen Europe for years, many of whom had been born in China. Such jolly Germans, such cultured Italians, such pleasant-spoken ci-devant Vichy Frenchmen. How well-dressed and well-kept their women were, how anxious, even eager to please, to prove their devotion to the now victorious cause, and to the young and potent and reasonably personable officers who represent it. After many an afternoon so well spent, I would arise and take a rickshaw to one of the city gates to be there at the sunset closing, and would observe how, when half the massy portal was swung shut, the traffic would increase and thicken, and the sound of cries come from far down the road which led outside the city, and a swollen stream pour and rush faster and faster, men and women on foot and clutching bundles, and carriers with sedan chairs, and families leading heavily laden ox carts and horses, children with hair like manes, trotting women swollen in pregnancy, old women staggering on tiny bound feet, infants clinging to their bent backs. The caravans alone did not increase their pace at this time. Slow, severe, and solemn, woolly, double-humped, pad-footed, blunt, their long necks shaking strings of huge blue beads and bronze bells crudely cast at some distant forge in the Gobi or at the shore of Lop Nor, the camels came. By their sides were skull-capped Turkomen, or Buryat Mongols with their hair in thick queues. My eyes scanned every face and every form in all this, but I did not find what I looked for. Then I would go and eat, while the gates swung shut and the loungers dispersed, murmuring and muttering of the Baalu, the said to be approaching slowly but steadily, and as yet undefeated Baalu, the communist Eighth Route Army, and the air grew dark and cold. One afternoon I chose to visit some of the temples, not the well-frequented ones, such as those of Heaven, Agriculture, Confucius, and the Lamas, the ones not on the tourist lists, but remarkable for historical monuments, not preserved, in a manner of speaking, by any of the governments which had held Peking since the days of the great Dr. Sun. In these places, the progress of decay had gone on absolutely unchecked, and the monks had long ago sold everything they could, and the last fleck of paint had peeled from the idols. Here the clergy earned cornmeal, Rice in North China was a delicacy, not a staple, by renting out the courtyards for monthly fairs and charging stud fees for the services of their Pekingese dogs. Worshippers were few and elderly. Such, I imagine, must have been the temples in the last days of Rome, while the Vandal and Goth equivalents of the Eighth Root Army made plans to invest the city at their leisure. These ancients were pleased to see me and brought bowls of thin tea and offered to sell me dog-eared copies of pornographic works, poorly illustrated, which I declined. Later, outside in the street, there was an altercation between a huge and pockmarked rickshaw boy and a Marine. I stepped up to restore order, could not have avoided it since the crowd had already seen me, and met the man in black. I do not mean a foreign priest. The coolie was cuffed and sent his way by the man in black, and the Marine told to go elsewhere by me. The man in black seemed quite happy at my having come along. The incident could have gotten out of hand, and he stuck to me and walked with me and spoke to me loudly in poor English, and I suffered it because of the face he would gain by having been seen with me. Of course, I knew what he was, and he must have known that I knew. I did not relish the idea of yet another pot of thin tea, but he all but elbowed me into his home, where my search ended. The civil police in Peking were nothing at all. The Japanese army had not left much for them to do, nor now did the Chinese Nationalist Army, nor the U.S. forces, MPs, and SPs. So the Peking police force directed traffic and cuffed recalcitrant rickshaw coolies and collected the pittance which inflation made nothing of. Black is not a good color for uniforms, nor does it go well with a sallow skin. She was not sallow. I drank cup after cup of that vile unsugared tea just to see her pour it. Her nose was not flat. When he asked her to go and borrow money to buy some cakes, not knowing that I could understand, I managed to slip him some money beneath the table. He was startled and embarrassed at this as well. After that, the advantage was even more mine. She caught my glance, and the color deepened in her cheeks. She went for the cakes. He told me his account of woes, how his father, a street mountebank of some sort, had starved himself for years in order to buy him an appointment on the police force, and how it had come to nothing at all, salary worth nothing, Cumshaw a little more. How he admired the Americans, which was more than I did myself. Gradually, with many diversions, circumlocutions, and euphuisms, he inquired about the chances of our doing some business. Of course, I agreed. She returned. I stayed long. She lighted the peanut oil lamps, and in the stove made a small fire of briquettes fashioned from coal dust, and I should judge by a faint but definite odor, dung. After that, I came often, and we made plans. I named sums of money which caused his mouth to open, a sight to sell dentifrice, indeed. Then, when his impatience was becoming irritating, I told him the whole thing was off. Military vigilance redoubled at the warehouses, so on. I made a convincing story. He almost wept. He had debts. He had borrowed money on his hopes to pay them. No one could have been more sympathetic than I. I convinced him that I wished only to help him. Then, over several dinner tables, I told him that I was planning to take a concubine shortly. My schedule, naturally, would leave less time for these pleasant conversations and equally pleasant dinners. The woman was not selected yet, but this should not take long. Finally, the suggestion came from him, as I had hoped it would, and I let him convince me. This was the only amusing part of the conversation. I suppose he must have convinced her. I paid him well enough. There was the apartment to furnish and other expenses, clothes for her, what have you. Expenses. So I was obliged to do some business after all, but not, of course, with him. The sulfa deal was dull enough, even at the price I got per tablet, but the thought of having sold the blood plasma as an elixir for aging Chinese vitality, masculine, was droll beyond words. So my life began, my real life, for which the rest had been mere waiting and anticipation, and I feel the same was true of her. What had she known of living? He had bought her as I had bought her, but my teeth were not decayed, nor did I have to borrow money if I wanted cakes for tea. In the end, he became importunate, and it was necessary to take steps to dispense with him. Each state has the sovereign right, indeed the duty, to protect its own existence. Thus, if bishops plot against the red governments, or policemen against the Kuomintang government, the results are inevitable. He had plotted against me. The curious thing is that she seemed genuinely sorry to hear that he'd been shot, and as she seemed more beautiful in sorrow, I encouraged her. When she seemed disinclined to regard this as the right moment for love, I humbled her. In the end, she came to accept this as she did to accept everything I did as proper, simply because it was I who had done it. I. She was a world which I had created, and behold, it was very good. My fellow officers continued, some of them, their joint excursions to the stews of Chien Men. Others engaged in equally absurd projects, sponsoring impecunious students at the Protestant university, or underwriting the care of orphans at the local convent schools. I even accompanied my immediate superior to tea one afternoon and gravely heard the Anglican bishop discuss the moral regeneration of mankind, after which he told some capital stories which he had read in Punch several generations ago. With equal gravity, I made a contribution to the old man's worthy cause of the moment. Afterwards, she and I went out in my jeep and had the chief lama show us the image of a genie said to be the superior of rhinoceros horn in the amorous pharmacopoeia, if one only indulged him in a rather high-priced votive lamp which burned butter. The old Tibetan, in his sales talk, pointed out to us the Passion Buddha's 4 arms, with 2 of which he held the female figure while feeding her with the other 2. But neither this nor the third thing he was doing interested me as much as his head. It was a bull's head, huge, brutal, insensate, glaring. If I am to be a god, I will be such a god as this, I thought. Part man and part bull? No. But what? Part man and... I took her home that she might worship me. Afterwards, she burned the brass butter lamps before me and the sticks of incense. I believe it was the following day that we saw the old Chinese. We were dining in a White Russian restaurant, and from the unusual excellence of the food and the way the others looked at me, I could sense that awareness of my true nature and its approaching epiphany was beginning to be felt. The persimmons of Peking are not like the American persimmons. They are larger and flattened at each end. In order for the flavor to be at its best, the fruits must have begun to rot. The top is removed and cream is put on, heavy cream which has begun to turn sour. This is food fit for a god, and I was the only one present who was eating it. The Russians thought that persimmons were only for the Chinese, and the Chinese did not eat cream. There was an American at the next table, in the guise of an interfering angel, talking about famine relief. The fool did not realize that famine is itself a relief, better even than war, more selective in weeding out the unfit and reducing the surfeit of people from which swarming areas such as China and India are always suffering. I smiled as I heard him, and savored the contrast between the sweet and the sour on my spoon, and I heard her draw in her breath, and I looked down, and there was the old Chinese, in his smutty robe and with some object wrapped in grimed cloth next to him as he squatted on the floor. I heard her murmur something to him in Chinese. She greeted him, called him Lao Ye, old master or sir, and something else which I knew but could not place. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and cheap scent. The fool at the next table threw the old man some money and gestured him to begin. His appearance was like that of any beggar, a wrinkled face, 2 or 3 brown teeth showing when he smiled in that fawning way. He unwrapped his bundle, and it was an empty chinaware bowl and 2 wooden wands. He covered the bowl with cloth again, wrapped it with wands, uncovered it, and there was a goldfish swimming. He covered, he wrapped and whisked away the cloth, and the bowl was gone. I darted my foot out to the place where it had been, but there was nothing there. The American at the next table spread out a newspaper on the floor. The old man rolled his sleeves up his withered, scrannel, pallid, sallow arms. He spread the cloth, struck it with his sticks, and then removed it, showing a much larger bowl with the goldfish on top of the newspaper. So it had not come from some recess in the floor, nor from his sleeve. I did not like to see anyone else exercising power. I spoke roughly to the old man, and he giggled nervously and gathered his things together. The fools opposite began to protest. I looked at them, and their voices died away. I looked at her to see if she would still presume to call him old master, but she was my creation, and she laughed aloud at him, and this pleased me. My powers increased. With drops of ink I could kill, and I could make alive. The agents of the men of Yan'an came to me at night, and I wrote things for them, and they left offerings of money on the table. Infinitely adaptive, I, polymorphous, porphyrogenitive, creating iniquity, transgression, and sin. But sometimes at night, when they had left and we had gone to bed and I pretended to sleep as others, sometimes there was a noise of a faint rattling, and I saw something in the room turning and flashing like a flash of gold, and the shadows loomed like the shadow of an old man. And once it came to me, the meaning of the Chinese words she had used once. They meant father-in-law, but I could not remember when she had used them, though distantly I knew she had no more husband. I awoke her and made her worship me, and I was infinitely godlike. When was this? Long ago, perhaps. It seems that I do not remember as well as formerly. There is so little to remember of present life. I have withdrawn from the world. I do not really know where I now am. There is a wall of some sort. It extends everywhere I turn. It is white. Often I press my lips against it. I have lips. I do not know if I have hands and feet, but I do not need them. The light, too, has an odd quality here. Sometimes I seem to be in a small place, and at other times it seems larger. And in between these times, something passes overhead, and all goes dark, and there is a noise like the beating of heavy staves, and then it is as if I am nothing, no place. But then all is as before, and there is light once more, and I can move freely through the light, up and down. I can turn, and when I turn swiftly, I can see a flashing of gold, of something gold, and this pleases and diverts me. But when I am still, I cannot see it at all.
What did you guys think of Dagon by Avram Davidson?
What a tale.
What a tale. Is that a pun
so
too?
This is my first time. Oh, what's that?
Is that another pun?
Oh, yeah. And the fins.
The
Oh, yeah.
fins.
We got to the end of the story and I just said fiend.
Yes.
So this is my first time reading Avram Davidson. This billed to me as a science fiction writer, and I went in expecting science fiction. What I got was not what most people would consider SF. That being said, does this feel like it has anything in common with science fiction? Like, we can get out of the way that it doesn't feel like science fiction. Does it feel like it was written by a science fiction writer?
Oh, that's a good question. I should clarify. So Dragon Skin Drum, one thing is the other story that's also realistic was published in Kenyon Review. I misspoke earlier. This one maybe wasn't published in a science fiction journal. I got to find out where Dagon is published. Maybe it's also Kenyon Review. But you're right. It's not science fiction at all. It has a fantasy element, and Avram Davidson wrote lots of fantasy too. But I think it reminds me of, in Genre Podcast we read a long time ago by Cordwainer Smith, a story where there's a soldier who kind of becomes very rude, and he's using lots of Chinese terms, but using them pretty loosely and using them kind of in a rude way. And there's just two other people who are kind of more invested in China. So it's a similar setup to that science fiction story. I wonder if the treatment of these characters is somewhat science fiction, having kind of like a lunkhead and then 2 or 3 more serious characters. Did that feel science fiction-y at all? Or what were you thinking? What did you think?
A lunkhead and 2 or 3. Well, I view that as kind of a comedy thing. Maybe not a comedy thing, but something that, like, the differences in tone kind of bump up against each other and create interest and friction. And it's a tool in science fiction, but I just read a great essay that argued that the thing that makes SF actually SF is it starts with a premise that is not true. Okay. Like sand is made of cotton candy.
Okay.
We're going to take that not true premise and we are going to see what follows from that not true premise. And, you can just kind of like think back to all the SF you've ever read and ask yourself, what is the not true premise that we are then building out of? Robots have consciousness and are real, or, things like that. So I guess if I was to look at the not true premise here, it's our main character is becoming Dagon, the fish god.
He's trapped in a bowl at the end. So if he's becoming Dagon
now, is it psychologically true? Is it like true in a realism sense? Is he, like, I guess that's kind of the ambiguity here. Is it poetically true?
But it's hard to say. It almost feels like he's hazing out in his room with this concubine of his, and just sort of gradually losing his, not so much losing his mind, but becoming so absorbed in his own feeling of that he ends up almost incapacitated. Because it seems like there's this theme of him being a god. He talks about being infinitely godlike, I think. At one point, he says, infinitely adaptive I, polymorphous, polygenerative, creating iniquity, transgression, and sin. It says he created this world with his concubine. So at the end, he's really emphasizing how he feels like a god. But then in the final couple of paragraphs, it's more like he's hazing up. Like that godlikeness is almost, I don't know, silencing him or something, making him just, he has no memories anymore. He has no sort of there's nothing to remember of his present life. Because he's almost like he's so satisfied with his godlike nature that he's stopped doing anything. Because you don't actually be satisfied, you just luxuriate in it. So I kind of understood the end as him just being sort of like locked almost in like this prison of his own, his own sense of godlikeness, his own sort of solipsism.
So just to pull out a quote, he says, final paragraph, he says, when was this? That's how we start the paragraph. And that kind of reveals that the narrator, like the entirety of the story, takes place in the past. And the narrator is speaking from a different time than everything we've just read. So we have a jump. And he says, when was this? Long ago, perhaps. It seems that I do not remember as well as formerly. There is so little to remember of present life. I have withdrawn from the world. I do not really know where I now am. There is a wall of some sort. It extends everywhere I turn. It is white. Often I press my lips against it. So
yeah. So are we literally just dealing with the story of like a man who becomes a fish? Now in his head, he sort of like thinks he's becoming some sort of fish god, like Dagon. But in actuality, he's just a goldfish in a bowl.
Mm-hmm.
And is there some sort of sense here of like, well, would you feel very similarly, regardless of whether you're a gold? How would you know if you're a goldfish or a god? Because you feel complete.
I mean, goldfish are gods of their own little universe.
Yes, exactly.
Their own little ponds or their own little.
I think it's very interesting because right at the beginning of the story, he introduced this scene of the fish. It's fishes when it's multiple different species of fish, isn't it? So he speculates about fishes. He says, quote, I mused upon the mystery of fish, their strange and mindless beauty, how innocently evil they prey upon each other, devouring the weaker and smaller without rage or shout or change of countenance. There in the realm of water, which is also earth and air to them, the great fish passed up and down, growing old without aging and enjoying eternal growth without the softness of obesity. So I think there's this sort of like dog eat dog world, except for it's more of a fish eat fish world that he's picturing here, where like fish, because they have a slightly different environment with the weightlessness, the water is also their earth and their air. They can basically grow infinitely as long as something else doesn't come just larger and more predators to sort of reduce them. There's sort of maybe certain limits in the ocean, but they can theoretically get very large. Think like these enormous lobsters that they speculate being at the bottom of the ocean, which is just these enormous, unfathomably large lobsters. And it seems like there's some idea going on here that's very similar to that. That he's sort of fantasizing about this. And I feel like that kind of, you talk about living in China, I just think like there can be that sense in China of like lack of limitations almost that there would be in, in like, for example, England or the US. And people can sort of lose themselves, like kind of like the Mr. Curtis figure we ran into that we spoke about earlier.
Well, he characterizes these fish as like all they're doing in there is they're eating each other, they're growing larger, and they're spawning. So there's no thought here. It's just kind of like an autopilot of eating, growing, having sex. In a sense, they're living amoral lives, these fish. And he characterizes the fish as a kind of like amoral being. The other great amoral beings of the culture are the Greek and Roman gods. You know what I mean? Like what is Zeus doing? What is Hercules doing? What are all the Minerva? What are all these ancient Roman gods that you find in Homer doing, if not just partying up on Mount Olympus, going down to the world to have oftentimes unconsensual sex, and wielding their power in ways that mortals can't really comprehend.
Yes.
And I think that that's a really cool comparison to compare the big fish in the pond to a Zeus.
Yeah.
Like,
I mean, yeah, it's a very common way of speaking, isn't it? Like, would you rather be a big fish in a small pond or a small fish in a big pond?
Yeah.
But it seems at the end he's confined to a fishbowl. So it seems like there's some kind of statement there about that kind of hubristic ambition.
I like that thing he says about fish having a strange and mindless beauty, because it like the fish don't perceive themselves as having a strange and mindless beauty. It's someone looking at fish. It's the person standing outside of the fishbowl who sees them and says, wow, there's an allure here. And I can't help but wonder if, like, upon announcing that fish are beautiful because of their amorality, their dog eat dogness, their fish eat fishness, he's kind of signaling his intent and his desire to become Dagon.
Oh,
Is that his desire?
Well, I mean, I'm wondering.
At one point, like he looks at this guy with like a bull head and says, I want to be a god too, a god of some kind. But I don't think he ever explicitly says, I want to be Dagon.
Can you talk about something being beautiful without also implicitly announcing your desire for it?
but what about the difference between desire for it and the desire to become it? I guess.
Well,
I
mean, I guess if I see a fish and say how beautiful it is,
trying to become the fish.
You know, well, I mean, it's like what is the beautiful thing about it? Like I don't say, oh, that's a beautiful fish, look at the way it moves, and then say, I should really eat that thing. I mean, you know what I mean? Like that's a different kind of appreciation of beauty.
Yeah.
I think that like the beauty of the fish is like the beauty of the dancer, if that makes sense. And you don't, I mean, I don't know. I'm just wondering, I'm just trying to piece together why he
there's a sense for the fish of like lacking the certain limitations that other beings seem to have, right? For example, upon their size. You know, the extent to which like ants can't grow very big because if they grew to a certain size, then their bodies would be too heavy for them due to some complicated thing about gravity that I can't really articulate. But there's still nonetheless this sort of like big resistance above the water. But in the water, like the water is their earth and their air. So there's a sense of, like I was saying before, like things can grow infinitely large. And it just seems like he feels that he can continue to grow infinitely large. And it seems to me that there's the moral going on here, which is like, while he thinks he's going infinitely large, to an outsider, he just looks like a goldfish in a fishbowl.
Going around and around and
around. Yeah. The fish doesn't perceive the relative smallness of their cage.
Yeah. And it's like he wants to conquer, like, you know, I'm going to be the most, you know, I'm going to manipulate people and be the most powerful man in, you know, Peking, in Beijing. But, you know, on a cosmic scale, maybe, what is that to anybody?
Yeah, I think that's the right track to follow.
That seems to be the mood of the story to me as well. Like, there's a sense of this character's really not very, like, this is a horrible character. This narrator he's neither a hero nor even an anti-hero. He's just he's quite despicable. He manipulates people. Like, he hears of other soldiers who were like doing ridiculous things, like sponsoring people in their education and helping them start businesses or whatever. And he's just there exploiting people for concubines and just generally causing mischief and being mean to old magicians.
Yeah, he even has that old man killed. Like he humiliates him. He goes to meet an old man. He's wandering. He talks about wandering through these alleyways. He's a soldier who kind of like almost leaves the army and just decides he's going to be a complete scalawag and just start wandering through alleyways and see what mischief he gets up into. And he goes to this house. He helps this man, kind of. And the man invites him into his house, says, have some tea with me. And then he gives the man some money to go get cakes, and that humiliates the man. Then he says, I want to buy that concubine from you. After he does that, he lives with the old man, I think in his house for a while, or he buys his own house actually, but he eventually kills that man. He like gets just tired of seeing him all the time. So he has him shot. He's extremely selfish. This reminds me kind of when we read, you mentioned the Quiet American earlier, which happens in Vietnam. And we saw a scene with some, I think it was American soldiers, could be English soldiers, but Zac compared them to pirates. I think maybe Graham Greene compares them to pirates. And then you said, are the English teachers of today now the sailors of the pirates of yesterday? You know, people who are going around and traveling now, sometimes they're really good teachers, often are just people who want to live an amoral life and don't mind getting up to teach at 2 p.m. in the afternoon, you know, drink all night and then teach hungover.
Yeah,
it's a very minimal trade-off, you know. I can't believe I gotta wake up in time for my 2 p.m. class.
And often they don't. They show up late.
No, I
But
think there's definitely something to that. And actually, when you said pirates there, like
Yeah.
when you were talking about genre before, like what genre we would put Dagon in, actually the first one that came to mind to me was like someone who's been what do they say, marooned from a pirate ship by the willing, like he's chosen to be marooned, like he's sort of come there with the army in 1945. And actually there's some very interesting contextual stuff there as well, where he's coming into a sort of like, you know, a major city where I think at this time the nationalists were still in power, but had been battered pretty badly by the Japanese. So there's still all these foreigners, like, you know, you mentioned like Vichy Frenchmen and Italians and all sorts of foreigners who are doing quite well for themselves in China. And then there's a lot of local people who really want to gain face by speaking to like foreigners and being associated with foreigners, which is who the narrator manipulates, you know, uses his influence as a foreigner for evil, essentially, because like we're saying, a lot of people come and live abroad with less than noble intentions, you know, because they feel like they're going to be a big fish in a relative small pond with their wealth and their power and their relative like rarity in terms of like there's not many people like them there. And I think it does really reflect that very well. And so I think the fish thing is a very powerful image of that, this sort of fishy fish world.
I think that's
what do we know about
you go ahead.
Go on, Bob.
Well,
go on.
Mine I want to wait in case Emma comes anyway, so you go ahead first, actually.
What do we know about Dagon, the god? Do we know anything?
God from
well, I mean, I looked it up before, and it was a god in the Hebrew Bible. It's a god that was worshipped by the Philistines, and so somehow the word Dagon, it was thought at the time that the Hebrew Bible was being written to like that it was very similar to the word fish, I think, in Hebrew. So they speculated that it could be some kind of fish god. I think recent historical sort of scholarship has proven that to be false. However, most like popular uses of Dagon, I think there's even one by Lovecraft, all use it as this image of like the fish god. So as far as culture, as far as literary culture is concerned, it's a fish god. But in terms of historical fact, it's not. But in terms of the discourse, that's what it represents.
That's interesting.
And it's interesting that the story, I think there's a sort of really complex aspect here of like power and decay, is like just two main themes that came to mind. Because this story is introduced by a quote at the beginning. I don't know where this quote is from, but it says, "Then the Lord of the Philistines gathered together to rejoice before Dagon their god. And behold, the image of Dagon was fallen upon its face to the ground, with both its face and his hands broken off, and only the fishy part of Dagon was left to him." And now I'm reading that.
That's actually from the Bible.
Is that from the Bible?
That's that I believe. I looked it up, and I think it was in Samuel, but I don't quote me on that. As I say this in a recording.
So it almost seems like Dagon, this story by Avram Davidson, is kind of like a reimagining in 1945 China of this sort of idea of like, we've got this great powerful god, and he's maybe, as you're suggesting, Zach, sort of kind of aspiring to that sort of state himself. But it's already sort of foreshadowed right at the beginning in that first quote that this statue is going to fall on its ground and all it's going to be left is the fishy parts, which is to say it's going to lose its human aspect. And then at the end of the story, our narrator becomes what he deems matchingly powerful because of his absolute dominant influence over this one Chinese concubine, which is kind of pathetic when you really think about it in perspective. And he ends up just living as a goldfish in a fishbowl. That's to say he's lost his human parts. So it seems like it's almost like Avram Grant's taken this little part about Dagon in the Bible and just spun a whole like modern narrative to it, used it as one big allegory for maybe what the people in China were like in 1945. But I can kind of understand how it connects to the biblical, tradition there. But why is it Avram Grant's choosing to set it in China in 1945? Like, what's going on here? What's the motivation there? And what does he know about that period?
I don't know enough to answer, but I do know that Avram did live in China around this time, probably maybe 5 years, 6 years before Dagon was published. And so he has two stories that are actually set in China. He traveled a lot, went to many, 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 many different places, but I know he's in China for a long time, enough to learn a good deal of Chinese. He was there for at least a year, I think, right around the same time. But I'm hoping Emma can join any second, because we've read a few stories and you guys would really like these stories by Avram, where it's an almost Avram-like narrator. It's not really, but it's all told in the eye, and it's where Avram has been. But the characters never really like what I know of Avram's personality. It's very different, but it always is someone who's traveling somewhere, and in some way, this one, the character is just despicable. Some of the past ones are almost likable, but they're always doing something that makes you feel a little disgusted. And so it's interesting to see these kind of traveling characters and then see them almost as like warnings to people. Like, if you're going to travel, that's great. Don't do this. Don't be like this kind of person. For example, we read one with Seth Davis. Emma and I read it with Seth Davis called The Third Sacred Well from the Temple. This one's great. It's about this guy moves to a country where the dollar is really high. So all of these expats go to this bar all the time. It's just an expat bar, and they love it because everything's so cheap and they don't have to work. They just live there and it's so cheap. But then one day, another expat comes in who wants to start publicizing this place and writing lots of articles about it. So lots of people will come. And all the other expats decide, oh my God, that's going to ruin this place. It's going to ruin the culture. It's going to change everything. But what's really is going to happen is what they realize is all the people who actually live there, they'll start getting money from tourism, but these expats want their free sandwiches. So they end up murdering this other guy. So what at first looks like foreigners caring about a country just turns out they just want to keep it selfishly for themselves at a low price. And so this person who is like criticizing the other soldiers at first and saying, oh, they're doing these stupid things. He criticizes another guy who's trying to stop poverty, I think.
Yeah, exactly.
And then he's so much worse.
He just wants to keep it as this small little pond in which he's the big fish.
Yeah. Like if he can keep that pond smaller, he can continue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's it. And I feel like that is really like what this allegory is really trying to say, I think. That foreigners can go to another country and with their superior power, rather than using that to improve the country, they're incentivized to keep it as a small pond, which they can dominate in.
Yeah, I think that's very true. Keep his fishbowl a small.
So it's interesting that that's like a theme in other stories as well, because that's kind of like what I got from this story in terms of the imagery and the overall context. And I think it's also interesting that the first paragraph, he's quite contemptuous of, other cultures like the Aztecs and the Chinese. He's like, these guys discovered the wheel, they discovered gunpowder, and what did they produce with it? Toys.
Toys.
Firecrackers. They enjoyed themselves and stayed peaceful, those fools. Look what we did with it. We used it to conquer. Those foolish locals. And it's kind of like, all right, yeah, maybe, or maybe they just thought we could make guns or we could just shoot some fireworks, and decided for the former, for the latter. And I would say that is probably more a world I would want to live in.
Yeah, world of firecrackers, yeah.
World of firecrackers and toy cars,
Not danger around every corner. Yeah.
No danger.
Yeah.
All right, well, any further thoughts on this story?
I loved some of the sentences. I thought some great writing. I think there was one particular sentence about a camel, which I thought was particularly impressive. Just impressively, he's got a great way with sentences. He's clearly an obsessive lover of sentence craft, which I have to admit I respect. Yeah, this sentence here. So he's talking about. You'll hear what he's talking about at the end of the sentence. Slow, severe, and solemn, woolly, double-humped, pad-footed, blunt, their long necks shaking strings of huge blue beads and bronze bells crudely cast at some distant forge in the Gobi or at the shore of Loch Nor, the camels came.
Camels came.
The sentence really there is the camels came.
Yeah.
We have this enormous like series of like descriptions and ridiculous, increasingly elaborate adjectives, and I enjoyed some of the sentences quite a bit in the story. So that's one thing I would add as well.
Yeah. He has permanently changed the way I think about fish. So
yes,
camels.
Big thankful for that.
Yeah. I want to ask you guys in a second. We always ask, who do you see playing these characters? Like if this was, Seth wants to get some of these made into movies. So if we could cast this movie, who would we do? But I do have one thing that I want to mention, because since we're going on to Dune very soon in our genre podcast, I think Dune is such an interesting book for lots of different reasons. But we have a character here who goes to a different world, and instead of just criticizing everything constantly and pretending like, I mean, he basically becomes the king of the world anyway. But I
He
like
becomes
this
the
character.
world. Yeah.
He becomes the world, but I like this character so far. At no point do I ever like the character in this story. So it's interesting to see like an approach to going somewhere new and learning while you're there versus just assuming it's all toys or so simple you can learn the language. He talks about learning the difference between, I think, chestnut and peach. And he says, oh, you can learn Chinese so easily. So it's just criticism, and he automatically assumes he is a god. Whereas Paul Atreides, we'll see.
I met a few people like that.
Oh yeah, yeah. Teachers.
Yeah, foreign teachers.
Yeah, the pirates of today.
Pirates of today.
So yeah, I wanted to ask you guys. So, who do you see? Maybe we
pirates can't do any of the things that pirates can't do. But still drink all the rum.
Oh yes, they certainly do that. Who do you see playing some of these characters? Like, we have kind of some main potential characters. The first man that he meets, maybe the magician, his concubine, and then just the main character, Dagon. Who would you see playing some of these people?
You know, I kind of had, like, when I was thinking about this, it was hard not to just think like, oh, this kind of reminds me of that movie, so I'd cast that person. But you know what? If he was a little bit younger, I would say an Alec Baldwin or maybe a Mel Gibson. You know,
Mel Gibson
as the main
someone
character?
who looks like someone who in their youth has been very vital and full of energy, but has an edge to them, has a dark side to them, but now is becoming increasingly flabby and complacent.
I'm exactly with you. I just came up with a different name. Brendan Fraser.
Oh yes,
he's too nice. He's too nice, man.
I want to see him with a little edge. You know, a little cut.
He's got to have his Tarantino moment. You know, his career. You know, second act.
Yeah.
As the bad guy.
I want to see him with a little edge.
This is George of the Jungle. This is the Mummy. You know, we can't just have him as a hard edge. No, it doesn't work.
Yeah. All right. Okay. To be honest, I don't know who to play the magician or the concubine, primarily because I'm not that familiar with like I feel like you need Chinese actors to do this well, and I don't have a very good like.
Well, we could always get Tom Cruise.
Yeah, The Last Samurai.
And
get Tom Cruise in.
Get Matt Damon.
I just watched this movie. He doesn't look. The point of the movie, it's like a Dune story. The point, it's not that he's the last samurai. The last samurai is an actual, Japanese warlord guy. Tom Cruise is just the perspective in which the audience sees this story play out. Leave Tom alone.
He's a great actor.
You just love a white savior, don't you, Zach? You love a white savior.
I think
I would say though, no, there is one actor I know would be good in this as the old magician, the father-in-law, Lao Ye. I'm just trying to find his name, but he's in a movie called The Flowers of Shanghai, based on a book by Eileen Chang, actually. But he's also very, very famous Hollywood actor. He was in a big film recently as well. He was in Everything, Everywhere, All at the Time, all at once.
I want to see that really badly.
The Old Man in the Wheelchair.
I haven't seen it.
What? You haven't seen that?
No, I really want to see it.
That's crazy.
Just watch it today. Just watch it today.
It's great fun.
Okay.
It's
like,
great
don't
fun.
even whatever plans you had, just cancel them and watch it today.
Great movie. So fun. Pure entertainment. But yeah, the old man in that wheelchair when he was younger. He was a great actor. So I would put him. He still is a great actor, but he's a little bit old now. He could still actually, as the old man, he could probably still do that. I'm trying to find his name.
So
I have come across it before.
We are against the idea of Ian McKellen reprising his role as an old magician.
Oh, fish magician, Ian McKellen. Yeah,
he did it so well as Gandalf.
I think that could work.
There's a great show here now in Taiwan that got a lot of awards this year. It's called Sikaluo, and there's a white savior character in there, and it's this actor. This is interesting because there's lots of, there's always like the funny foreigner in China and also in Taiwan. There's this whole show about these ridiculous foreigners speaking bad Chinese, but there is one guy who took it really seriously and tried to make his Chinese as good as possible, and he's a French guy. Oh, I've seen that actor. That actor's great.
He's in Big Trouble in Little China as well.
Yeah, he's in lots of movies.
Big Trouble in Little China as well. Yeah, he plays the demon, the real bad guy in great actor. James Wong. Yeah. But so there's this French guy named Fabio who I think would be really good. He's really sexy, so it probably wouldn't work for this character. But he plays the same character where he kind of becomes a god, and this guy has really taken it seriously, and he's a great actor. And he's done such a cool job in the show. So I feel like he would be good. And then there's a younger guy in that show too, probably too young for the magician, but he's great at just like, I feel like you could do a lot of intense stares with this magician, like just staring the guy into a fish. I feel like he would be good. That's a good show if you have time to see that. So Sikaluo.
Imagine if your parents named you Fabio and you weren't sexy.
Yeah, I know.
What a horrible life.
Oh, you mean ugly Fabio?
Yeah. for the concubine, does she? I mean, I don't think she has any lines. I think you just need a what do you call the background actors? Extra. I think this is like an extra, like I don't think she has any lines. That's not like that's like not like a knock against it. It's just like, I think that the fundamental nature of this character is as an object, a background piece, an extra, you know what I mean? So like, we don't need to spend this film adaptation's budget on hiring, an A-list Hollywood star.
I think you're right too, because it fits better with the way the story is told, like from the perspective of this kind of despicable narrator. Like you said, he does treat her only as an object completely, like a vase, so she doesn't get any lines. I don't even know if we learn her name. He
describes her as a work of his own creation.
Yeah, very disturbing.
Yeah.
And she was a world that I created, and behold, it was good, he said.
Yeah. So there should just be no extra even.
Avram has a real sense of humor. I respect that about him.
Yeah.
He's funny.
Yeah, he definitely has some good humor. Yeah, great writing. We'll read more. I think we should get one of his stories for genre sometime. But anyway, I'll let you guys go.
Yeah.
We should read a sci-fi story of Avram sometime for genre. We can revisit it. But thank you very much, John and Zach of Genre Podcast.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
It's been good talking to you.
I enjoyed the story a lot, and it was good to unpick it. I feel like I've now got a real good grasp of the story.
Yeah, and I feel like of the author too, it'll be easy to return to Avram later. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, and I will never look at fish the same. So thank you.
Yeah, these amoral fish, they look so cute in their bowls, but
they're strange and mindless beauty.
All right, John. I'll talk to you later, John.
Innocently evil. Innocently.
Talk to you later, Bob and John.
Talk to you later, Zach and Bob.
Sounds like a story to me, some crazy fable that you would not believe.